And we're back.
And we're back to Marxism-Leninism.
I love the communist gnome.
Comrades, a revolution is impossible without a revolutionary situation. We have been driven from our homes, from our birthlands by imperialists. Imperialists with fangs. We stand before a capitalistic, vampiric army bent on sucking the people dry for their own private profit. We must organize. We must revolt. They are resistant to change. But change is being thrust upon us whether we want it or not. My own kind is the worst. The Blagini do not realize that what serves society will serve them also. We've been isolated for too long. I have read the works of Marx and Lenin. I understand that without a revolutionary theory, there cannot be a revolutionary movement. Revolutions are the locomotives of history. But locomotives also need passengers, and we are a bit thin in that department. I put a message to my people on the magic tape to let them know that they may come out of hiding and follow you, that you will protect them and bring them to this shelter. They will do so.
I love the Lenin flat cap.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't realize this. That's a good point.
But until then, it is good that they are sheep. Sometimes history needs a tiny nudge in the right place.
That is exactly my expression.
Private property. Fairies of the world unite.
And there we go. Perfect end. So today, because I mean, there's an endless number of things I could ramble on about, more or less accuracy. But today I'm going to be talking about socialism in Eastern Europe, or not even pre, but like pre-World War II, because that's what this guy is kind of echoing. That's the ethos that he's trying to spread. And I've said this before, I will say it again. That shit would not fly to humans of the same, the humans that live in this village, because they've seen communism up close. If they don't remember it, their parents do. And, they've seen what it does, and they have no interest in continuing. That said, okay. Let me think. Let me roll back. So, okay. Socialism in general is... sorry, sorry. I was dealing with something in the background, but it's gone now. Socialism itself predates, Marx and Lenin. And people now tend to think of socialism and communism like it's the same thing, think that they're kind of inevitably tied, and kind of the same way a lot of people think that capitalism is just trickle-down economics and free market capitalism, and people have forgotten there are alternate theories of stuff like Keynesian economics, which is basically you have a free market as well as a government that's constantly taxing industries and then using those taxes to pump money back into the economy to get velocity of money flowing. And America's mid-century prosperity, I think people keep harking back to often when they talk about, if you get American politicians who talk about past prosperity, that is the economic system that they used to build it, not the trickle-down economics they currently espouse. And that's another story. So socialism itself goes back a ways, probably to the very start of the 1800s, and it started taking shape in Western Europe among industrial workers, where it was just it was working conditions were horrifying. You probably learned about this in school, even in passing. The early factories were truly horrifying places. The thing is, there's also gradually in the background of the Industrial Revolution so people started having this thought, a light bulb going on in their heads, and which basically boils down to, if we can get the state to pay kids to learn like how to read, then we can just give them a manual, and then they can use that to operate. We don't have to risk them. We don't have to risk them not knowing what gut gauges mean. We don't have to rely on institutional knowledge, and so we can just fire people and give them a book that we've had other people we already fired write, and that's all they need. And that's basically the birth of public education, which is kind of sad when you think about it. But well, it's also more complicated than that. But that's the reason why so many modern high schools have distinct periods, because those are factory shifts. Like, they borrowed that format wholesale because they are teaching kids to be factory workers, for instance. They told us that in school. I don't know if they taught you that in school. I don't know how common that is.
No, I went to school in the South.
Well, okay, that's fair. But yeah, that is where. That's what public education started as. That's the whole idea. Trouble is, if you teach people how to read at all, then they can expand their ability to read. And they can start reading other things, such as literature that you don't like. And literacy and stuff like newspapers and pamphlets massively predate modern industrialism by centuries, but really common literacy to the point where you can, if you hire some poor person off the street, literacy used to be something that was, even in the most literate societies before the modern era had, we were looking at maybe 50% of the population, maybe. But once you got to the point where 90% of the population you could expect could do at least basic reading, you started getting a lot of pamphlets going around all over the place, spreading ideas about, this is not, we should not have to literally watch our kids get sucked into machinery all day, socialism was born out of the idea that, the people who run the factories are going to hurt people below them unless those people below them try and force them out of control, wherever that is, whatever that happens to be. And it's like a bunch of different, we've talked a little bit about syndicalism, which is basically an idea which revolves around, using labor unions as a basis of government, if I remember right. And you know.
Yes. Essentially, that's it. It's a non-Marxist leftist theory that basically states that unions, co-ops, and the like are the path to socialism. A lot of people get socialism and communism mixed up.
Yes, there are actually stages of all of that, and socialists don't even agree on the stages necessarily.
Well, socialists never agree.
They never agree.
Leftists never agree on anything.
That's fact. But it's as socialism was taking shape, and as we know it in Western Europe, there were a bunch of different ways that people approached it. And Karl Marx, he was a writer and a theorist, and you've probably heard his name, but he was not quite a historian, but something similar. He wrote a lot about stuff that he observed in prior political movements. He wrote a lot about, one of his biggest works was a big analysis of Napoleon III taking over France and establishing the empire. And he thought it was a bad move, and he wrote extensively about it. And basically, there are today, basically, this is kind of not true. It's one of those generalizations that's such a huge generalization that's not very useful. But the idea of revolutionary socialism, the idea that you have to violently overthrow, even maybe not blood flowing through the streets violently, but forcefully remove whoever's on top, That's one branch of socialism. And that's the school that dominates that is Marxism and Leninism. And that's what the Soviet Union ran itself off. The other side, non-revolutionary socialism, matured into democratic socialism. And that's basically what, like in Scandinavia, that's what most major political parties espouse to some extent. That's what labor in Britain used to espouse, so it drifted right in the 80s and 90s in response to Thatcher. But there was a point where the lines were not drawn and things were not mature in the 1800s. Things were bad in Western Europe in the first half of the whole of the 19th century. But things were even worse in Eastern. Look, in Western Europe, there were enough, there was, as bad as things could get for people on the ground, there was a blossoming middle class that had enough time and, economic stability to, make a living writing on this sort of thing. And they had enough connection to people down on the ground that they could afford to empathize with. They weren't aliens. They were, so to speak. They were just somebody who lived part of the same country, part of the same culture, spoke the same language. They just happened to live in the wrong part of town, and they ended up getting brutalized. And a lot of socialist theorists were middle-class people who looked at, the horrors of the working class and felt empathy and tried to write based on that. That would eventually cause trouble down the line, but it'll probably sometime later in this lecture series, I'll be talking about the Soviet Union proper and what happened there with intellectuals, but that's a ways down. All of this is happening in Western Europe. Eastern Europe is, compared to Western Europe, there are parts of Eastern Europe that are quite prosperous. There are parts of Eastern Europe that are very sophisticated. They're even though their economic output wasn't as high in many ways, cultural output, in terms of stories and culture, stuff like music, stuff like novels was just as high as in Western Europe. But it was just freaking.
I have not smoked so.
Oh hey, it's this guy.
No, but yep.
Yeah, this guy's pretty cool. This guy is
Mangala's son.
But a useful.
Sort of. He's a collaborator's son.
Wine will hold for a secure. Strong palinka will do for disinfectant. And a doctor must never abuse his orderlies.
That's a good
so
one.
You do not find a shit taken in your locker.
Don't shit flows downhill.
Circulating what is needed to where it
But,
is needed.
I've got this. I don't know if you have anything you want to say on this guy, or just want me to keep lecturing.
No, we learn a lot more about him in his second mission, which is more in-depth. This is very much
The injured, always more injured they bring to me.
just our beginning introduction to the Red Hand, which is a subplot that runs through this area.
That's very Soviet subplot.
It is good vampires sterilize their steel.
So anyway, Eastern Europe it wasn't that Eastern Europe was full of stupid people or something. It's that Eastern Europe was big, it was underdeveloped, and it was stereotyped as full of stupid people.
Not for sightseeing, I think.
A lot of socialist theorists, especially early on, had this really deep contempt for certain parts of society. And these are middle-class people, so if you've ever heard the term lumpen proletariat, that term was used for basically urban undesirables. People, prostitutes and beggars, or even street cleaners, people who are just at the bottom, who are not working in labor that, as far as, well-heeled, 19th century equivalents of suburban, skilled labor. They thought they were just dumb and could not contribute to their ideas of social change, so they dismissed them. They just resorted to stereotypes and ended up shutting them out as a class. And this would later have some very weird consequences because even if you're at the bottom of the social ladder, you're still a bursty. And there are definitely people who can sit at the bottom and claw their way back up. And that's something that early socialist theorists did not account for. But they also had a very similar approach to people out in the farms, who they generally thought were also country bumpkins and had very few prospects of advancement, no real means or need to gain education. They were just distant to them. And you can't get more distant than somewhere in like the huge endless plains of Eastern Europe where aren't great, like aren't steppes, but aren't much better. It's just enough to grow something for your family and something for the Tsar and something to keep Cossacks from burning their house down, and that's about it. What they really did not see Eastern Europe as the kind of place where there was sort of paradisical socialist society where everyone was equal and where like people could debate theory on the street. They did not see that as something that could happen. And yet it did. That's where the Soviet Union rose. And in China, the People's Republic of China grew out of equally rural Chinese populations too.
Quick access
And
inventory updated.
probably won't have a chance to talk about the early history of the PRC, but that's like it was not. It followed, if you know anything about what Marxist theory envisions as the path of progress of human civilization, there's a reason that they use terms like Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist instead of just Marxist, because they did not measure up to what those theorists in Western Europe thought. That's not how they thought this would work at all. But in Eastern Europe, well, I mean, I said this earlier. A lot of early revolutionary socialist theories hinged on the idea of educated workers rising up to seize control of the cities. Like they believed that is where that's where the capable people were. That's where the people who were educated enough to grasp these ideas were based. That's where they believed all of capital would be based. And if they could seize control of society's capital, then they kind of pulled the strings everywhere else, in theory. But like, out in Eastern Europe, people out there weren't any like people in the cities weren't actually any smarter than rural farmers. They just had more access to education. And when it came down to it, I need to go on a tangent about this. So, okay. Eastern Europe, post-1900-ish, was basically three big countries and a few dozen, not a few dozen, but like maybe half a dozen smaller countries scattered around. That was the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Russian Empire. And all of them really hated the people who were living in the middle. They're famous for what they did to Poles, and they're famous for what they did to Jews, but that's also that hits worst stuff later, so I'm not going to get into that directly, but people in those cultural centers in Russia, in Germany and Austria saw themselves as inherently better than peasants out on the fringe. And there was all kinds of different social groups that just had not been able to stand up to the imperial powers to either side. And they were ground down, they were exploited, they were used, they were brutalized. It was real bad. And so when World War I rolled around, and basically war embroiled the eastern half of the continent, just like it embroiled the western part of the continent too, you got a lot of revolutions, and it got a lot of uprisings. Like, in the West, we think of World War I as the War of Trenches, because that's what it looked like in France. It looked, in Eastern Europe, that there were trenches used, but there was enough land to cover that there really wasn't any practical way to build defensive works that could cover a whole, you could not block off France like they managed to do with World War I. or rather, you could block off France. You could not block off Eastern Europe. You can't block off the entire length of Poland from the Baltics down to the Carpathians or something. And it was a rolling war with a lot of vicious fighting that ended up breaking every country it touched. They all melted down, and in the teens and 20s, there was a big rise of basically in many cases for the first time ever. There were these people had countries that were based on these were okay. Have I ever talked to you about the difference between a nation and a state?
I believe we did at one point.
Yeah. Do you think how long ago was it? Do you know?
Not enough for me to remember.
Uh,
A nation is based on the people. A state is artificial.
yeah, more or less. A state is a government. A nation is a identity. And the first half of the 20th century was the era of the nation state in Eastern Europe, especially, or more like the first third. Because that was a really big
miracles today, I'm afraid.
that really took fire in that area. And I mentioned cultural output because even though they weren't producing the same kind of technological output that Western Europe was, you were getting you had a lot of Polish nationalist poets. You had a lot of poets in general, a lot of writers, a lot of musicians, a lot of theorists who were focused on the idea of a nation and of a culture in that area. And as the various empires in the area broke down, or were broken down at gunpoint, you had nations that were coming forward for the first time to make their own choices and trying to chart their own destinies. Meanwhile, out east, Russia fell to the communists. And I don't want to go too deep into how that happened because that's actually a really complicated story. But there came a point, we don't remember this, we are not taught about this in school. In the West, there's kind of, even in an in-depth history course, you will usually just learn there was this whatever it talks about Eastern Europe, and between the world wars, it'll talk about basically there was a rise of the nations out east. There was the Russian Civil War, and then it just kind of skips forward to World War II. And skips over, among many things, how there was a big period in the early 20s where the Soviet Union invaded almost the entirety of Eastern Europe. And they conquered their way all the way about halfway through Poland and got stopped at, I believe, the Vistula River.
The Miracle on the Vistula.
Yes.
Yes.
A big famous battle that you talk to a Pole who identifies as a Pole, they will be able to tell you all about it, and you won't unless if you grew up, and if you just read you just went to school in your ordinary English speaking school. But the Soviet Union was built on this kind of weird semi-industrial, semi-agrarian basis that Lenin had to Frankenstein together. Because the thing about
let's talk about what makes Marxism-Leninism different from Marxism to get an idea of why.
Yeah.
Because what makes insofar as my understanding is, Leninism says eventually there will become a revolutionary mass of the educated populace who will become so discontent that they will rise up. And Lenin says, no, there doesn't have to be a mass. There can be a vanguard party, a group of educated people who pull the rest of the nation of the group forward. And that works in Eastern Europe because that's what he had. He had a small educated group, and he had everybody else who didn't know what socialism was.
And he basically sold socialism to a bunch of uneducated peasants who were still ultimately smart enough to catch on and form their own opinions on what's going on. And because, at the end of the day, Marx was wrong about the idea of the critical mass. like people. I remember I read the Communist Manifesto. Like as part, we actually had a short unit on Marxism in graduate school. We're talking about all the theories of history. I read that thing. I was super unimpressed because this is a guy like the Communist Manifesto talks about. It was published in I think 1848, and
Well, it's a political pamphlet.
Yeah,
It's literally just this is the program of our party.
It is a literal manifesto, but it also lays out a theory of history that basically says it says that critical mass had already been reached in 1848, and strongly implied that within the lifetimes of the people reading it, the communists start along that process towards a sort of truly egalitarian society was going to start. It was inevitable and irresistible. And that still hasn't started. And people are still that's where the term late stage capitalism got coined. And capitalism now looks extremely different from capitalism then. But, it still hasn't ended in the meantime. People still talk about late stage capitalism like that's a useful category. It was ultimately, my personal disdain for Marxism as a philosophy especially comes from that particular strain of confidently predicting that they can tell the course of society and then failing to do so. And just about every branch of Marxism, whether it takes the Leninist branch or anything else, almost always falls victim to that sort of looking into your crystal ball of stories about the future that you really think make tons and tons of sense. And they never do because they always don't pan out. Yes, but that wasn't Marxism and Leninism put the vanguard party in there to drag the process along, and it found
in my opinion, therefore started its downfall because you inherently have this group that you say is better educated, better than the populace, and that group is entrenched in power, and suddenly, guess what? You have a powerful group entrenched in power that doesn't want to share its power.
You just built a different class system, and that's what defined the Soviet Union. It was sort of semi-meritocratic, but it still had a pronounced class system. It was classless society. But it's to the peoples of Eastern Europe who were seeing the Soviets rush in the early 20s. There were native communist, socialist governments, in the wake of World War I, as people were trying to figure out what would happen to the remnants of the Austrian Empire. The Hungarian government actually got overthrown by local communists who started declaring wars before they got smacked down by the Allies. There were native socialist movements in the area, but they were not Leninists. They didn't have that sort of very specific character that the Soviet Union developed very quickly. So it was very foreign to them. It was something that was not... Well, okay, I'm going to skip forward a lot. Let's just skip right over World War II, because that's not relevant to what we're talking about, and that's a big old can of worms. But in the wake of World War II, not only did the Soviet Union move in, but they did a lot of stuff where they would... Famously, Poland, they actually stopped on the Polish border during a massive uprising and let the Poles and Germans kill each other, and then just moved in and took over Poland. After promising the Polish resistance that was uprising that they would be marching in to fight alongside them, they did a lot of dirty shit to get the communist bloc in place. And they imposed communism from the top down. They imposed their own weird Marxist-Leninist version of socialism that
Well, now you've made the mistake again. You've confused communism and socialism.
I mean, yeah. The thing is, no one's ever seen it. Nobody's ever actually seen communism. And it's kind of There's also a trend in a lot of historians will kind of sloppily use socialism to talk about the philosophy, and communism to talk about specifically the Soviet Union and specifically Marxism-Leninism. And
which is wrong because communism is not inherent to Marxism-Leninism. I'm always, whenever I talk about this stuff, because I'm a pedantic asshole, I'm always very clear that I'm talking about Marxism-Leninism as practiced by the Soviet Union. That is not a philosophy I personally agree with. I'm a syndicalist.
it is kind of hard.
And you still meet Marxist-Leninists because it is very attractive because it gives you personally an ego boost. You are the vanguard party.
And
You know more than the regular person, and you will lead these people to victory. It is inherently an ego massager.
And it also combines with and it builds on the native Marxism belief. I want to call it teleology. That's not what it means. It's just like belief that with a sense of historical inevitability that makes it feel like you are going to inevitably succeed and do something great. And it's really easy for that to warm into somebody's head. And that's part of the appeal of Marxism in general. Granted, these days you don't find a whole lot of committed revolutionaries because everybody knows what happened to the Soviet Union. And as much, China, the PRC barely even talks about communism anymore these days. It's just like they're state capitalists, and that's what government likes. So that's what it is. They went all in on nationalism, and now they have kind of vaguely socialist features, but it's just a dictatorship.
Even more literally now that we had their most recent party Congress.
Yeah, It
is Xi Jinping's party now.
Mm-hmm. It's just another cult.
They literally arrested the former president on camera in the middle of the party Congress.
Yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of rumors around that. There are always a bunch of rumors around Chinese, politics. So who even knows? I'm hearing.
They're just reading the tea leaves the same way they used to do with the Kremlin.
Yep. Yeah. God, Kremlinology is so fun to read about because nobody in the West knew what the Kremlin was thinking at any given time. So people would look into their crystal balls and see more bullshit and very confidently predict that bullshit because that's the best that they could hope to do. Yeah. And I still talk about I love the Soviet cold. One month premier has a wild cold. Next month there's a new premier. He just died. They had thorough enough control over media access that's all they needed to do. And yeah, there are multiple parts of this game where you have to translate fucking Romanian, and I'm impressed by their dedication, but that is a lot to ask.
They probably had Romanians on the dev team.
Oh, yeah,
there's
definitely.
no way they organically thought, let's pick an Eastern European country that isn't Russia and landed on Romania.
It's Transylvania.
That is true.
They almost certainly picked it based
true.
on that alone. But God, I need to actually talk. I think I started talking about Transylvania last episode and never went anywhere with it. But that's another thing. But
we have time.
I mean,
this is 3 sections, and we're gonna have time. But let's get back. So the Soviet Union takes control of Eastern Europe, but there's this thing we never talk about is other communist movements that aren't Marxist-Leninist in the, let's call it the early period, the post-World War I disaster period, when everything's burning down and reshaping.
Mm-hmm.
We very rarely talk about these non-Marxist-Leninist ideologies, like whatever Rosa Luxemburg was up to.
Yeah, and we don't talk
before she got murdered.
Yeah, we don't talk about stuff that's barely.
We generally don't talk about them because they weren't successful.
Yeah,
either because they were eventually subsumed by Marxism-Leninism, or because they all got murdered,
Yeah, there's that.
or both.
Now, in a lot of cases, that they also just kind of got subsumed into post-war labor movements and ended up getting absorbed by into democratic socialism. But that was a lot rarer than either getting shot or getting eaten. It's like, and the funny thing is, I'm not going to like. It's not that they were completely inconsequential, because later writers would often cite them, would often work their ideas into other things, but they didn't do anything. They mostly, because the thing is, before the rise of the Soviet Union, like, they had the First Internationale, they had international organizations, but those were basically just, they were like, they were taking donations from people. They were based on a much smaller scale. And once you got the Soviet Union over, like, actually starting to try and fund international communist movements, basically, if you wanted to engage in communism on a big scale, or engage in, like, socialist ideology and theory or whatever, however you choose to think of it, however you choose to phrase it, your choices were to go with a debating society and fall victim to a dictatorship or not get listened to, or to go talk to the Soviet representative and get money and support and literature and actually a chance to hopefully do something. A lot of people fell victim to that. They ended up, when they weren't able to, like, eat, to sort of, like, assimilate other competing socialist movements or get them to try to destroy, they just out-competed them. Because you didn't, like, for instance, the Chinese Communist Party, started as a reading group in a university that the Soviet Union got a wind of, and then just started pumping money into in huge amounts until it grew into a proper party. From something that had, like, a couple dozen students reading translated communist literature in Northern China. Like, and that's kind of an extreme example, but that's the scale of influence the Soviet Union had at the time. And shit went south. Long story short, I don't want to get too deep into the trouble with history is that once you get into stuff that people remember, it gets really heated because people remember it. So I don't want to get too deep into what...
As my father, a boomer, once said, when I proved him wrong about Carter, it does not matter what really happened, I lived through it.
Yeah. There are...
That is a phrase from him I have never forgotten. It does not matter what really happened, I lived through it.
Mm-hmm. That was... and you can't... There comes a point where it's just... it's really hard to argue this shit with people, because... if you can't tell them what the experience was wrong, even if what the experience was misattributed or they had the wrong idea about something, there's no way that you can phrase that where it doesn't sound like a personal attack, so it's impossible to talk about it. But unless you're, like, very, very good at what you do, or unless you have, like, an in or something, but, that's another story. So I don't want to get too deep into, like, post-Soviet Europe, like, post-war Europe, the Soviet Union's domination of the area, and the shit that it did, but basically communism and socialism in Eastern Europe, what I've been trying to get at here, is wildly different than
a
what
thoroughly poisoned well.
I mean, yeah, you can probably say that. I mean, you have to have, like, I don't think that socialism as a whole is is like a nightmare that's doomed to hurt everyone that touches it, but I also don't have that high of an opinion of it as a philosophy, because it has a lot of issues with assumptions that it makes about human nature that are 150 years old, at least. So I can't really say that, socialism is... I'm not going to speak loudly in its favor either. But what happened in Eastern Europe was not what the people who put that ideology together planned on. It was entirely outside of their experience. It was entirely outside of what they assumed. It just completely wildly went differently.
Most people, they leave me alone to drink.
Well, we're in Romania, so let's talk about Transylvania now. We've
Okay.
gone over
Forget the
sort of
thrill
interperiod
of
communism,
red trail
interwar
of
communism
Mhm.
in Eastern Europe.
grip of knife.
So let's
Or at
talk
least
about
a
one
prime
part of
of
Eastern
Long
Europe.
meat of dying
Thing about Transylvania. Transylvania literally means land beyond the forest in
I
Latin.
drink to remember.
And it's kind of telling that
Now,
of the
drink
various
together.
groups
We
that
have
are
matter
in
to
like the
discuss.
area, only
No
one of
rush.
them has any actual connection to the Latin language. It
My
is
place is in the wild.
Transylvania is kind of
Where
weird
your
geographically in
concern
that
himself with
it sits
your
in the
family.
sits nestled in the Carpathian Mountains,
Trap
so that
myself
half of
in
it is completely shielded from everything else, and half of it is completely open to everything else. So it's kind of a bowl people will try and march into and take over and use as a defensive bulwark, only for their efforts to collapse west of it, and shit goes south, and somebody else sweeps in to take it
I
over.
have scouted past the
It's
Strigoi,
very,
and the war
and it's
wizards,
also
out to the edge of the
kind of
field.
distant from the cores of
Saw them,
civilization.
the creatures.
I don't. Does this sound familiar? Have I said this before?
Nest.
It sounds familiar, but I might have heard it somewhere else. I mean,
reckon
it depends what we
I
mean by
drink
cores of
to
civilization. I mean,
Well,
it's
and
far
that's an
from
extreme.
Rome, but
Yeah,
just
that's
about
that's an extremely
that's an
relevant
extremely-
phrase. Relative phrase, but like there are a lot of cores of civilization is an extremely bad way to put it. When I'm talking about cores of power,
no more debt
there
to
are
repay.
Yes,
in
it is far from cores of power.
yeah.
To start with, it's in Eastern Europe. So
Yeah,
there's
but like there are gravitational centers in the Aegean Sea. And in the area around Moscow, in the area like in parts of what you like. I can't call them Germany and Austria because those didn't exist in the way we would think of them, but like there were centers of power in those areas, and Transylvania sat right about in the middle. Well, at first it sat in between the center of power in what's modern like central Hungary and a center of power out near the Aegean. And then Russia came along, and the Hungarian center of power got submerged into the Austrian center of power for a little bit further west, so on and so forth. But it sat right at the middle. It was prime real estate. It's perfect for all kinds of uses, except it was really far away from everything. So you got a lot of people fighting over it forever. And there's a lot of...
the Afghanistan problem, essentially.
Pretty much, yeah. The thing about Afghanistan is that, like, Afghanistan is more of a...
Afghanistan's on the Silk Road, which is why it was so important.
Yeah,
It is
Afghanistan
a
sits...
crossroad of empires.
Yeah.
Yes, I believe it was
And,
called.
I mean, like, people call it the graveyard of empires, and that's less because it kills empires and more because that's about as far as most empires ever reach, and they don't make it any farther and then collapse. And you can talk about the Soviet Union, you can talk about Alexander, you can talk about the British Empire. You can talk, if you really want to, you can say it's America, but that doesn't fit the pattern because it's not America's invasion of Afghanistan had very little to do with geography. It just kind of there were a bunch of other factors in play there, but that's another story. Like, Transylvania is kind of like that in West Side. And since it's so remote and it's been fought, it has a lot of different peoples who flowed in there. Before the 20th century kicked off, there weren't just ethnic Romanians lived there. There were a lot of ethnic Hungarians and ethnic Germans in large numbers. And there were ethnic Russians. And there were not only ethnic Ukrainians, but there were peoples who are related to Ukrainians, called the Ruthenians, who are, and I don't want to get into that relationship because that's actually politically contentious, but like, there were lots and lots of Jews, like up to 10% of the population, depending on who you ask. It's an immensely complicated area, and when you
those always turn out well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't say that they turned out well, but until the 20th century moved through, they kind of got along mostly. They hated each other, but then everybody hated each other everywhere. I wouldn't say it was the ethnic violence was more intense there than like less diverse areas. It was probably better than it was in Russia at least, because Transylvania's.
Well, that's not a high bar, dude.
I mean, yeah, that's fair. But like, because this was Austrian for like most of the early modern period, but like
There's a
that
difference
mixture.
between benign neglect and actively government-motivated pogrom.
Yeah, there's that part, but like that mixture of distance and complexity gave birth to some really complicated myth cycles and concepts. Like Dracula's the obvious one, but there's a reason that both werewolves and vampires can trace the history of the concept back to that specific area, and these days, like if you talk about supernatural monsters, you probably get some mixture of witches, ghosts, werewolves, and vampires, and it's kind of odd. I mean, check me if I'm wrong, and if you think there's something else that would come up if you ask somebody about it, unless you're talking about like generic slasher villains. But then,
Well, if you ask us, you get everything we've seen so far, which includes the Wendigo.
I mean, yeah, but like if you talk about stereotypical,
We're a little odd. I mean, if you ask someone who's a fan of this game, you get a lot of different answers. But
like if you have
they will mention werewolves and vampires, yes.
Yeah. And like, if you walk up to somebody on the street and ask what the first supernatural creatures that come to mind are, you'll get a mixture of vampires, ghosts, werewolves, and witches in various flavors and combinations. And
Well, you might also get zombies, depending. We see them more as a contagion. We see them more as a contagion thing nowadays than.
Yeah, the zombies are.
They're more a disease fear nowadays than
than
a supernatural thing.
Yeah, pretty much. There's a reason. Yeah, I would still classify them as supernatural because there's no disease on Earth is going to make a body start moving on its own. But like, as far as outlook goes, it is still zombies are pretty scientific these days.
I should know. I had a copy of the Zombie Survival Guide by Max Brooks.
Yeah.
Oh god, that movie was such a disappointment.
I remember reading World War Z and being really impressed. I hear the movie was just standard Hollywood.
It was, which is sad because, I mean, my idea for it was always get a bunch of different directors and have them do a bunch of different short films in different styles to match the movie, to match the book.
Yeah, because that's what the book was.
Instead, they make it like one long narrative about one dude, but they have to try to incorporate scenes from the novel, so it doesn't really work.
Yeah. It's like, and that book is it's an interview series, and a bunch of very interesting, very weird people who did a bunch of very interesting, very weird things, and Hollywood does not like that sort of thing. So there's that. That's what happened to it. You need an auteur to do that, and Hollywood has very few auteurs these days, and those that it does tend to specialize more in like technical, in either vision or very limited storytelling, rather than kind of sweeping narrative. Get out of. You don't have many George Lucases, let's say, and it hurts me in my soul that I just called George Lucas an auteur. He never was, but like that, you know. You get what I'm trying to ramble about?
Yeah, I get it.
Like,
the only one I can really think the only two I can really think of are Wes Anderson and Quentin Tarantino, and they both make the same sort of movie constantly.
Yeah, and I'm
not saying they're bad movies, but they're basically the same sort of movie.
Yeah, they make different kinds of, like, Wes Anderson makes weird movies, and I'm not using that to call them, like, weird, synonym for bad, just unusual. And Quentin Tarantino makes platonic action films.
I mean, I love Wes Anderson films. His visual style is very distinct. Like, you can see it once, and you can identify every movie he's ever made.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem here because that's his comfort zone. That's what he does. He does it really well. But, there's just not very much room for people who are flexible in Hollywood, unless
Have you
unless you're not
seen the SNL skit about Wes Anderson?
Nope.
They did a horror movie as by Wes Anderson, and it's phenomenal. It's hilarious.
The last Saturday night, last SNL skit I saw was the one with what's her name? She was in the new Ghostbusters as Holtzman. God, like I can't remember what her goddamn name is. And I know that movie was basically an SNL reunion, so that doesn't narrow it down. But and it was a skit about first verified alien abductions. And you had two hippies, one of whom was Ryan Gosling for some reason, talking about a transcendental experience. And she was playing Trailer Trash, who just, she got abducted. And they did.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that one.
That was absolutely amazing. That was really funny.
My dong hole and my wrong hole. Yeah, I remember that.
Just lining up to very respectfully slap her abs. But
And that's this video. Next
Yeah,
week
pretty
we'll
much.
be talking about the Orthodox Church.
See ya.